So now that we know what cells are, what we're going to do is we're going to take a closer look at cells by looking at the idea of cell organelles. So a cell organelle is a specialized structure within a cell that help it to maintain a function. So a little bit about organelles themselves. We listed last time a list of things that cells need to do in order to be considered alive. So all cells have to carry out various cellular activities in order to live. These activities might include obtaining food and using energy. So it might have to do with metabolism, storing and transporting materials, and reproducing. These are just a few activities that a cell might need to do, depending on the cell in your body. And we're going to talk about cell specialization later on in this unit. There could be other things in this list. In eukaryotes, these jobs are carried out by specialized cell parts known as organelles. They work together to keep the cell healthy. So essentially, you can almost think of the cell itself as a factory, and the cell organelles being different components of the factory that work together to keep the factory running. So you might have the assembly line, you might have the accounting office, you might have the mailroom. So it's all different parts of the actual cell that's all required to allow the cell to actually function. So what we're going to look at now is we are going to look at different cell organelles that exist within a cell, and we are going to figure out what they can do to actually add to the cell function. So we're going to talk about what that structure looks like and how that structure helps to support function. Let's start with the easiest one, and that easiest one is called cytoplasm. Sometimes it's actually so easy that students have a hard time figuring out what it is that cytoplasm does. So cytoplasm is in all organelles, all cells, I should say, and it's jelly-like fluid that all organelles are suspended in. So picture a cell filled with essentially like jello and stuff floating in the jello. The jello would be the cytoplasm. The cytoplasm is important because it's where most chemical reactions take place. So most of the chemical reactions in the cell, which is what allows the cell to have energy, that's where they happen. Also, it allows for transport. So it allows things to be passed from one organelle to another organelle. The cell membrane is next. So a cell membrane surrounds all cells and forms the outer barrier. So if we were actually looking at the cell membrane, we would be looking at this blue area here, and notice that it's a barrier between the cell and the environment. So cells are specialized little pods, and oftentimes they don't want what's out coming in, and oftentimes they don't want what's in coming out. Here's the tricky part though, is sometimes you have to get stuff out, and sometimes you have to get stuff in. So it's pretty tricky. So membranes allow only certain substances to pass in. So those certain substances you might want inside the cell are food and water. You also might want to have oxygen come in. You want to have things go out like waste and sometimes carbon dioxide. So you have to be very careful with how the cell membrane is structured. Right now, all you need to know about the cell membrane is that it's flexible and has two layers. In grade 11 biology, we'll talk more about the fluid mosaic model and this idea of a phospholipid bilayer. That helps to explain how the cell membrane is so good at keeping some stuff out and bringing some stuff in. So if you're curious about how the cell membrane actually acts to filter out some stuff, we'll talk about it in grade 11. Right now, I just like to think about the cell membrane almost as like a bodyguard. So it's what allows certain stuff in. You have to get past the bodyguard to get into the cell. The nucleus is something else that you might have heard of. So you often study this in grade 7. The nucleus is kind of like the control center of the cell. It's often the easiest to see under a microscope as it's a dark dot right in the middle. So it's a large sphere, it's found inside the cell, and what the nucleus actually has is it has all the genetic information. So it holds the blueprints for how to build the entire cell. So it's one of the most important sections. It also helps to control cell activity, so it can turn certain cell activity on and off. So we say it's like the control center or the brain of the cell. The coded instructions that are found within it is called DNA. So if you've ever heard of the term DNA before, your DNA, all of your DNA is actually found within a cell. So your entire DNA, which makes up who you are, that entire length of molecule is actually found in every single cell in your body within the organelle. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acids. And again, if you're curious about the structure of DNA, we talk about it a little bit more in grade 11 biology. So we'll actually look at the structure, what it's made up of, what it's so specific. It's found in the form of chromosomes, and we're going to talk more about these chromosomes in a couple of videos when we talk about mitosis. And all those chromosomes are located within the nucleus. So you can actually, in this picture, see some of those chromosomes. All those little X shapes there, those are all chromosomes. Now let's take a look at our next organelle. And our next organelle is called the mitochondria. This is my husband's favorite organelle because he always jokes that it's the only thing he remembers from grade 10 science. Most cells contain many mitochondria. So if it's a cell that requires a lot of energy or powers a lot of energy like muscle cells, you're going to see many mitochondria. The mitochondria you can see here highlighted. So they actually have their own membrane. And then within them, they have very distinct folds. These folds are called cristae. So those folds, again, are important for the structure and the function of the mitochondria. We'll talk about what these folds do a little bit more if you take grade 12 biology. We can think about them as tiny power plants. So they actually help to provide the energy for the cell through something called cell respiration. Cell respiration you actually studied in grade 9 science, believe it or not. Cell respiration is the idea that you take sugar, we call that glucose or C6H12O6, and you combine that sugar with oxygen. And cell respiration is going to take that and it's going to turn it into carbon dioxide. It's going to turn it into water. And most importantly, it's going to turn it into energy. So your body is able to take sugar or the food that you make or eat and the oxygen that you breathe, and it's able to combine it so that you can actually get usable energy, the waste products being water, carbon dioxide, and then energy being a useful byproduct. So that cellular respiration is what's actually happening in the mitochondria, and that's what actually helps to provide your cell with energy that it needs, and your body with energy that it needs to survive. Our next organelle is called the endoplasmic reticulum. Just so fun to say. What these organelles are, it's a series of interconnecting membrane tubes. So you can actually see here, this almost reminds me of a maze, right? So you have all these interconnecting tubes, and these interconnecting tubes actually usually come right off of the nucleus. So you've got the corner of a nucleus here, we can see the DNA inside, and we've got these interconnecting tubes coming from the outside. That's the endoplasmic reticulum. They might extend all the way from the nucleus to the cell membrane. What they do is they actually transport materials throughout the cell. So think of them almost as a highway. So they're a highway, these looks like almost like long highways to actually go through and transport material. Notice that there's little dots on these endoplasmic reticulums. These are called ribosomes. So this endoplasmic reticulum is called the rough endoplasmic reticulum. Your body also has something called the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. That's got no ribosomes, and that's linked to calcium storage. So you can actually see a rough and a smooth endoplasmic reticulum when we look at a zoomed out picture of the cell. Now let's talk about these ribosomes, which is what we just talked about with the endoplasmic reticulum. They are tiny. When I mean tiny, like these are the little dots here, those are ribosomes. So those little blue dots are ribosomes. What they are is protein factories. So you are actually like one giant protein. Everything in you is made up of protein. So when people say it's really important that you eat protein, it's because protein actually makes up everything. It makes up your hair, it makes up your muscles, it makes up the organs in your lungs. So protein is very important. Ribosomes make these proteins. So they're protein factories, and those proteins are necessary for all living things. They can be attached to the endoplasmic reticulum. So we can see them here on the endoplasmic reticulum. Here you can see the rough ER, and here you can see the smooth ER without any ribosomes. They can also be free floating as well too. So you can actually see ribosomes floating around in the actual cytoplasm themselves. Okay, let's talk about our next organelle. And our next organelle is actually present in this picture as well too. And this is called the Golgi bodies. So the Golgi bodies, what they look like are stacked membrane sacs. So here you can actually see it looks like a sac that's flat, surrounded by a membrane. I also think this kind of looks a bit like a flat stack of pancakes. So I always think of the Golgi body in the cell as a stack of pancakes. Maybe I just like food. What they do is they collect and process materials to be removed. So I always like to liken them to the post office. So they receive stuff from all over the cell, and they help to process and sort what needs to be moved and what needs to be actually removed from the cell. Once these materials is surrounded by mucus, they're actually secreted out of the cell and into somewhere on your body, your airways, your large intestine. So essentially these little membranes here, these little sacs, they'll actually pinch off. They're called vesicles, and they'll actually carry things out of the cell into the cell membrane. Our next organelle here is called a vacuole, just so fun to say. What a vacuole is, it's a single membrane sac which encloses a fluid. So here you can see quite a large vacuole. Vacuoles act to store stuff. So it's your storage space if you have extra fluid, if you have extra energy lying around. Vacuoles will act as a storage bag. They also could have other functions. So I just mentioned the storage of food and water. They could also help to remove substances from the cell. And in some types of cells, they can actually act for structure. So for example, this here is a plant cell. Plant cells are very rigid. So they have a large central vacuole, and that large central vacuole will be filled with fluid, and that allows plant cells to actually have their rigid nature. So that's why stems of flowers can actually grow so big. They have large central vacuoles in their cells that allow them to be more rigid and to grow taller. We are going to be looking at the difference between plant cells and animal cells. So you have a little bit of a summary that you have to read in the bottom of this note here about them. We're going to look right now at organisms that are only found in animal cells. So remember, eukaryotic multicellular organisms, we split into the branch of plants and animals. Let's focus on animals first and how they're different. Animals have something called lysosomes. What lysosomes are is they're those vacuoles we just talked about, but they're filled with digestive enzymes. So essentially they're lysosomes with a bunch of chemicals in it that can break stuff down. So it's going to help to break down food, and it also acts to recycle substances. So it's like a recycling plant of the actual cell itself. Also, only in animal cells is this idea of centrioles. They are star-shaped organelles, and they aid in cell division. Cell division is going to be the next large topic that we're going to cover. So just know that centrioles are involved in cell division right now. We'll talk about cell division when we get to our next big topic. Now let's take a look at organelles that are only found in plant cells. A couple organelles that are only in plants. The most obvious one is the cell wall. So the cell wall is a very rigid outer cell. This is actually outside of the membrane. So animal cells have a membrane. Plant cells also have a membrane. So here, this would be the membrane. The cell wall is outside of the membrane. It's incredibly rigid. So a cell wall will also help and support. So I talked before about the large central vacuole helping to support plants. The cell wall, which is very rigid, made up of cellulose, will also act to support plants and allow them to be rigid. Plants, as I mentioned before, have that large central vacuole. So animal cells do have vacuoles, but their vacuoles tend to be smaller and more spread out, whereas a plant cell has a large central vacuole. This is again for support of the plant cell. And your plant cell also has this thing called chloroplasts. I mentioned it in grade 9, and chloroplasts help with photosynthesis. So just a reminder of what photosynthesis is, because you saw this in grade 9 as well too. Photosynthesis is the opposite of cellular respiration. It's what plants do. So photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide, which plants breathe in, water, which we water plants with, and it combines it with energy. That helps to make sugar. That sugar can be used by the plants itself, or that's why we eat plants, it's for food, right? And plants also breathe out oxygen. So this is photosynthesis, and photosynthesis happens within the chloroplast. We can actually see the chloroplast here. So you can see all these little green things around. Those are all chloroplasts. They're like the powerhouse of the cell for plants. Now, plants still have mitochondria. Plants still undergo cellular respiration, but plants mostly undergo photosynthesis. So the chloroplasts here are these big green. Chloroplasts are actually always green. They have a pigment in them called chlorophyll that make them green. That's what also makes plants green as well too. And you can see these stacks called grana. These stacks are very distinct of chloroplasts, and we're actually going to go over them in more detail in grade 12. So if you take grade 12 biology, we'll talk about what these stacks do and how they help to aid in photosynthesis. So we've talked about organelles that can only be found in animal cells, and we've talked about organelles only found in plant cells. Now we're going to talk about some organelles found in only some types of specialized cells. So some cells are specialized, so they have specialized structures. One of those structures is what we call a flagellum. So a flagellum is, you can actually see it here, it's a long whip-like tail, and what it does is it helps cells to move. Not all cells need to move. In your body, a lot of your cells are stationary. They don't need to move around. They don't need to swim around, so they won't have this flagella. Cells that are required to move in your body will have this long whip-like tail, and it allows them to swim. In the same sense, some cells that also have to move will opt for its cilia instead. Cilia, you can see on the outside here, they're long hair-like structures. It's a little bit less of a rapid movement than a flagella. It's like a little kind of floating, a little bit slower, a little bit more controlled though, and it also helps in cell respiration. It also helps to move things past the cell. So it allows you to sweep things past the cell and keep going. We're going to look a little bit later at the cells of your respiratory tract because they might have cilia for other reasons as well too. So those are cell organelles. I would highly recommend that you have the organizer and use the organizer to help you actually go through and organize all your different cell organelles into a nice note. I would also recommend that you try to draw a picture. It doesn't have to be a really good picture. It can be a funny or silly picture, but oftentimes pictures help you to remember things.